So in this video, we're going to talk about JavaScript. So JavaScript is the behavioral part of the web. We have HTML, which is the framework, the structure. Then we have CSS, which is the styles. And then we have JavaScript, which is the behavior. Now, what I mean by behavior is interactivity. JavaScript can do a variety of things, and it's probably the most powerful scripting language there is right now. It's ubiquitous. It's seen throughout the entire web. So in learning JavaScript, we need to wrestle with the syntax, and it doesn't follow the syntax of like a traditional programming language like Java or C++. It has its own kind of flexible programming, and that's because it has developed over the years from its initial developer all the way through to its current state, which is ES6. So there's a bunch of different ways to do JavaScript, and in fact, what can be aggravating is when you're doing a lot of searching on the web for JavaScript functions and things that you need, that there are different types of JavaScript that you'll find are different solutions. So I'm going to just try to encapsulate the most important parts. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a JavaScript library in our project. And so that's the reason why I'm going over these basics, so that when we do the library, these basics will make sense. So if you take a look at the page that I have here, I have a simple main, I have a header, I have an H1, and then I have a section with a couple of things in here with IDs. So this first thing is a paragraph. The second thing is another paragraph, and then a button. And the button will allow us to click on it and do something with JavaScript. And I have some basic styles in here just to style up the page a bit. So let's go over into the JavaScript pane. We'll focus on this. So I have broken up this into a couple of different sections. And what I want to talk about first is variables. So a variable is just a value that you hold in a container. If you imagine a wallet could be a variable, and then whatever is inside the wallet would be the values. So here I'm setting variables in 3 different ways. So var is the traditional way in JavaScript. Var is short for variable. Then you declare what the variable name is, and there are syntax rules for declaring variable names. It can't start with a number. It can't be a JavaScript keyword like function or array or anything like that. So it has to be unique, followed by an equal sign, and then a value that you assign. Now this value is a type. It could be a number, it could be an integer, it could be text, it could be a string. There's a bunch of different things. It could be true or false, depending on what you want the variable to hold. So I have a var here of a, and it is equal to 1. Then the next thing is a let a variable, and this is new for ES6. There's let and const. Const means constant, which means that this variable can't be changed. That's constant value. I can't later on in the JavaScript program, I can't say const c equals 5 because I've already set const c equal to 3. So later on in the JavaScript, I can't change that value. But a let and a var are more flexible, and the values can be updated. So a let is, in this case, b equals 2. And then for my const, I'm saying c equals 3. So I'm storing those values. And where do they get stored? They get stored in the browser's memory. So until the browser's cache is cleared or the page is refreshed, these values will not appear. They'll get updated. And then I can reassign those values later on. So that's variables. And then if we want to hold more than one piece of information, what we can do is create an array. So an array is a string of, or a collection of variables, or values, I should say. So I have a let here of numbers equals, and I have all these random numbers starting with 8 and going up. So I have stored those in these brackets, and the syntax is inside the brackets separated by commas. These could be numbers, they could be string values, they could be true, false. They could be whatever. And here I have numbers that are just separating these items. In JavaScript, it's important to be able to select objects, to work with those objects on the page. So that's what I'm doing here with these variables. So I'm storing the HTML element inside of a variable, and then the first one is I'm saying in my button, and I'm pointing to where it is. And document is the entire HTML document. Dot get element by ID. It's looking for an ID, and here's my ID. ID equals activate. So that's my button. And then num para is document get element by ID num. So that's this first paragraph, and then the last one is certa, and that's this paragraph right here. So I'm storing those because I'm going to use those later on. And then JavaScript fires things called functions, and a function basically is a function that returns a value, or it performs an action. So in this particular case, I have a function here called showNum. The name of the function can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it's not a JavaScript keyword. And then you can see showNum. I'm just separating the two words with something that's called camel case. So show is lowercase, and then num, the first letter of the second word is uppercase, and that's called camel case. Then an open set of parentheses. This set of parentheses can hold parameter values, but I'm not passing a parameter right now. And then an open curly brace and a closing curly brace. And here inside the function, I'm saying look for the certa element, which is this PID, and I'm going to replace the inner HTML, basically whatever the HTML is in here, which is show value. I'm going to replace that with B plus A plus C. So that's going to take these three variables, it's going to add them together. And that function isn't going to fire right away. And the reason for that is because I have an event listener next. So I have a button here called activate. And remember earlier I created the my button variable to hold where that button is. So now I have a name for that button. So I'm saying to JavaScript, I'm saying look at my button and listen for an event. Add event listener. Listen for an event. What event we want to listen for is the click event. So right now JavaScript is just waiting, but when I click on this button, it's going to then fire a function called showNum, and this is the function that we have up here. So let's go ahead and try that. So if I click on activate, you see that JavaScript did the calculation. It did B plus A plus C, and it shows the number 6 here. So you can use JavaScript to do different functions. You can create calculators with JavaScript. You can do math quizzes and all kinds of fun stuff with numbers. But you can also do it so that it shows strings or values. A string is basically just text. But this function, when it was fired, it did this math sequence, and then it displayed the result right here. So also in JavaScript, we have something called conditional statements. And this one is a simple one, but it could be more complex than this. This one is just an if statement, but you can have switch statements. You can have if-else statements, if-else, if. So this can get really lengthy. But here we say if, and then inside of these open parentheses, we have a condition. So this is the condition. If A is greater than B, if you look up here, A is not greater than B. Right, B is greater than A. And then what do? So console.log, every browser has a console. And in CodePen, we have a console down here as well. So in that console, what I'm basically going to say is that it's false. A is not plus larger than B. And this is a string statement. And what I'm doing here is the parts that are variables in yellow here, those stand off by themselves, but the rest of it I have to build this string with concatenation, which is these plus symbols. And then I put in the text strings, so false plus a plus, and then etc. I just create this sentence down here. Now you're not going to see this in the console because this conditional is not within a function. So what we would have to do is we would have to put it in a function. And then we'd actually have to call the function. So I'm going to say function show, let's say function show condition. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to take this whole statement and just copy it and paste it in here. And then that's still not going to fire, so I need to fire this condition, this function. So I say show condition, and then that should show up in the console. So if I look in the console, it's telling me I have some errors in my code. Uncaught syntax error, unexpected token 4. A good console will tell you what number the line on, but that's how you would check for errors. I don't see the value, but also in CodePen down here, if you see a red exclamation point, that means that there's a problem with your code. I actually don't see that, so I don't know what that error is referring to. And then we have a concept here called loops. So in JavaScript, a loop is either a for loop or a for each loop. And basically what it'll do, it'll go through a series of elements, and then it's kind of like a function. It actually is a function, because you can see that the syntax here, we have these curly braces for parameters, and then we have an open curly brace and a closing curly brace. So there's 3 parts of this for loop. So the first part is the initiator. So I set the initiator I equals 0. And then I'm saying the condition in the next one, which is I is less than numbers, which is the array that we created up here, dot length, which means go through the entire array and grab all the values. And then I++ is the increment. And so I'm going to increment through that. This could be I minus minus, but to go down through the list, but I'm going up through the list. And then what I'm saying here is take the paragraph num para, which is right here, num, and I'm going to change the inner HTML, and I'm going to go through the entire array, and then I'm going to return each value of the array, and that's what you see here. So num, and all the values of that array are being showed or displayed right here. So that's just an overview of JavaScript. It's definitely more involved than that. There's a lot to it. We're going to take a look at JavaScript in a specific library, and a JavaScript library is essentially just a script that someone created and they posted it up on the web that you can take and you can put into your site, and then you can use with their documentation. Every JavaScript library has its own documentation that you can go through, and you can learn how the library works, and you can apply it to your site. So just keep that in mind. This is just an overview. It's not really like valuable functions, but it's something that we can build off of.